Most people believe advice is a form of kindness. When someone offers guidance, suggestions, or helpful observations, it feels supportive, even generous. Advice often carries the tone of care, experience, or concern. But psychology reveals that not all advice is truly about helping. In some situations, advice becomes something very different. It becomes a subtle way to control, influence, or quietly shift power in a relationship. The strange part is that this kind of control rarely looks aggressive. There are no raised voices, no obvious demands, and no direct orders. Instead, it arrives wrapped in friendliness. It appears thoughtful, considerate, and even protective. But underneath the surface, advice can sometimes function as a powerful psychological tool that shapes decisions, redirects behavior, and gradually changes how a person sees themselves. Once you begin to notice this pattern, it becomes surprisingly visible. You may start recognizing moments when advice carries a hidden pressure, or when a simple suggestion slowly turns into an invisible expectation. Human beings naturally respond to advice because advice triggers something deep in our psychology. When someone tells us what might be better for us, our mind automatically evaluates two things. First, we wonder whether the advice is correct, but second, we subconsciously evaluate the person giving it. We ask ourselves whether they know something we do not. If they appear confident, experienced, or concerned, the brain often assumes their suggestion deserves serious attention. This is where the psychological influence begins. Advice places the speaker in a subtle position of authority. Even when it is delivered casually, it implies knowledge, perspective, or insight that the listener may lack. Without realizing it, the listener begins to treat the speaker as someone whose judgment carries weight. In healthy situations, this dynamic can be beneficial. Good advice from knowledgeable people can genuinely improve decisions. But in other situations, advice becomes something more strategic. It becomes a method of shaping someone else's behavior while appearing helpful. One common form of this tactic happens when advice is framed as concern. Someone might say something like, "I'm only saying this because I care about you," or "I just want what's best for you." These phrases sound supportive, but they also create a psychological barrier against disagreement. If the listener rejects the advice, it can feel like rejecting the person's concern. The mind begins to experience a subtle pressure. Disagreeing may feel ungrateful, dismissive, or even disrespectful. As a result, the listener may accept advice not because they truly believe it, but because rejecting it creates emotional discomfort. This tactic becomes even stronger when advice is repeated frequently. When one person consistently offers suggestions about how another person should behave, what they should prioritize, or what decisions they should make, a quiet pattern begins to form. The listener slowly becomes conditioned to seek approval before acting. Over time, the person receiving advice may begin to question their own judgment. They might start asking for guidance even when they previously trusted their own decisions. This is not always intentional manipulation, but the psychological result is the same. The balance of confidence begins to shift. Another interesting pattern appears when advice is delivered with subtle criticism hidden inside it. For example, someone might say, "You might want to try organizing your work differently. It could make things easier." On the surface, this sounds helpful, but the message underneath suggests that the current approach is flawed. Advice like this can slowly reshape self-perception. When someone hears repeated suggestions about how they should improve, adjust, or reconsider their behavior, the brain starts to interpret these suggestions as evidence of inadequacy. Even if the advice is mild, the repetition can quietly erode confidence. Psychologists have long observed that influence often works best when it avoids confrontation. Direct control usually creates resistance, but suggestions, guidance, and friendly advice rarely trigger the same defensive response. Because advice feels optional, people lower their psychological defenses. This is why advice can become such an effective tool of influence. When someone suggests a different choice rather than demanding it, the listener often feels that the decision remains their own. But the suggestion itself has already shaped the options being considered. Another powerful element of this dynamic is timing. Advice is often given at moments when someone feels uncertain. When people face difficult decisions, emotional stress, or unfamiliar situations, they become more receptive to outside input. Their psychological defenses are lower because they are actively searching for clarity. In these moments, advice can carry enormous influence. A suggestion made during uncertainty can redirect someone's thinking entirely. What begins as a simple comment may end up shaping major life choices, relationships, or priorities. The interesting thing about this process is that the person giving advice may not always be aware of the influence they are exerting. Many people genuinely believe they are helping. But human communication is layered. Even well-intentioned advice can carry subtle power dynamics that change how people interact. One of the most revealing places where this pattern appears is within close relationships. Friends, partners, and family members often exchange advice frequently. Because the relationship already includes trust, suggestions carry even more weight. A partner might say, "Maybe you should focus more on this," or "I think it would be better if you handled that differently." These comments may come from genuine concern, but if one person consistently becomes the advisor while the other becomes the receiver of guidance, a quiet imbalance develops. The advisor begins to shape the direction of decisions, priorities, and behavior. The listener gradually adapts to that influence. Over time, the relationship can evolve into one where one person subtly directs the course of events. This pattern also appears in workplaces. In professional environments, advice often blends with authority. Managers, colleagues, and mentors regularly offer suggestions about how work should be approached. But sometimes advice becomes a strategic way of controlling outcomes without issuing direct instructions. Instead of saying what must be done, someone might say, "You might want to consider approaching it this way." The language remains soft and flexible, but the message carries a clear expectation. The person receiving the advice understands that ignoring the suggestion may have consequences. This creates an interesting psychological situation. Because the instruction was never explicit, the listener feels responsible for the final decision. Yet the suggestion has already shaped the acceptable direction. Another subtle form of control appears when advice is delivered publicly. When someone offers guidance in front of others, it can place the listener in a socially difficult position. Rejecting the advice may appear defensive or stubborn, especially if the advisor presents the suggestion as helpful. In these situations, people often accept the advice simply to avoid embarrassment or conflict. The social environment amplifies the pressure, even though the advice itself sounded friendly. Psychology also reveals that advice often influences people because it shifts attention. When someone suggests a particular solution, it directs the listener's focus toward that option. Other possibilities fade into the background. Even if the listener ultimately makes their own decision, the initial suggestion has already framed the situation. This phenomenon is closely related to what psychologists call cognitive framing. The way information is presented changes how people evaluate choices. Advice is essentially a form of framing. It highlights certain ideas while quietly minimizing others. Once you recognize this dynamic, everyday conversations begin to look different. You may start noticing how often advice appears in subtle ways. Sometimes it arrives as concern, sometimes as experience, sometimes as friendly guidance. You might also notice how easily advice influences your own thinking. A simple suggestion can linger in the mind long after the conversation ends. The brain replays the comment, analyzes it, and slowly adjusts its perspective. Understanding this psychological pattern does not mean advice should always be rejected. Advice can be valuable when it comes from genuine expertise, experience, or care. But awareness changes the way we process it. Instead of automatically absorbing suggestions, people who understand this dynamic pause for a moment. They ask themselves a simple question: is this advice expanding my thinking, or is it quietly narrowing it? This moment of awareness restores balance. It allows people to evaluate advice without surrendering their own judgment. At the same time, understanding this pattern also changes how we give advice to others. When people become aware of the hidden influence embedded in suggestions, they often become more careful about how they communicate. Rather than directing someone toward a particular decision, they may ask questions instead. Questions invite reflection without imposing direction. They allow the other person to explore possibilities while maintaining ownership of the final choice. In many ways, this approach respects the psychological independence of the listener. It encourages growth rather than quiet control. Human relationships are filled with subtle signals of influence. Advice is one of the most common and one of the most powerful. Because it appears friendly, helpful, and supportive, it often slips beneath our awareness. But once you begin recognizing the control tactic hidden inside friendly advice, something interesting happens. Conversations become clearer. The invisible power dynamics within relationships start to reveal themselves. You begin noticing when suggestions carry hidden expectations, when guidance becomes pressure, and when concern quietly shifts into influence. And perhaps the most important realization is this: the ability to think independently does not require rejecting advice. It requires understanding the psychology behind it. When people become aware of how influence works, they regain control of their own decisions. Friendly advice remains what it was always meant to be: a suggestion, not a direction. And that small shift in awareness changes the way every conversation is understood.